My name's Mike. I'm another pastor along with Pastor Gina. Pastor Ben is leading our online ministry right now. So it's great to be with you all worshiping online, here in the room. I know I haven't met everybody. We always have new people. In fact, some of you may know if you're regulars, we added some seats in the back, created some space that isn't so you can sit further back. That's actually so you can move a row or two up, but we're anticipating over the next several weeks that we'll continue to have new faces join us because you're inviting new people. Christmas season is a great time to invite people. All time is a great time, but people oftentimes at this time of year are open to re-engaging or engaging with church and faith for the first time. So be aware, be prayerful, be intentional, and leave the back rows for new people. So I like also the up front people. Thank you. So now, I don't know if you can imagine this, but imagine what it would feel like to stand up in front of hundreds of people on a weekend and then to have it historically preserved on the internet and talk about controversial topics that you know very little about. That's what I get to do today. So I want to, and part of this comes from, I'm leading a Advent Bible study. The weeks leading up to Christmas, we call Advent, the 4 weeks. I'm leading one on Tuesday at 2 o'clock and at 7 o'clock here at the church. You can join us if you want this Tuesday. But people asked me last Tuesday, and then also some of my different staff have heard from you all or received emails saying, Mike, help us understand the war in Israel and what's going on in the dynamics. And so I've been researching and listening to a variety of different resources, a variety of different voices. So I'm going to share a little bit, but the first thing I want to simply say is it's complicated. Which seems obvious, but I think that's important because people who will tell you it's not that complicated either are ignorant or have an agenda. And I want to claim the ignorant side, but I'll still say it's complicated. So I'll just share a few things that I've learned. If you know something that I don't know, please help me understand better. If you disagree with something I say, feel free to email me at Gina_Brinkman@COSWire. You're welcome. I need to throw Ben under the bus. I don't know why I didn't think Ben. All right, Ben, you're up next. So a couple things I've learned. Number one is there's significant religious differences. So Israel is primarily led by Jewish persons. Hamas, which has kind of been leading the war on behalf of the Palestinian people, Hamas is also known as the Israeli resistance movement, Islamic resistance movement, excuse me. By the way, when we use the word Islam and Muslim, Islam is the religion, Muslim is for those who practice, it's the same religion. And so there's significant differences between Muslim, Jewish, Christian, although we all claim our origin going back to Abraham. And so we're kind of a little bit of a sibling fight, and yet there's significant meaningful differences in religion. I also want to point out, though, to the idea that Judaism is like this or Islam is this is also ignorant. It would be like saying Christianity is this. So let's talk about Christianity. We're United Methodist Christians. If you go to other Christian communities in our community in St. Charles County, they're going to sound very, very different than how we sound. In fact, at the end of our service, we're going to have, I think, 10 people join the church. And part of that, we ask you to attend an explore course, to explore who we are as Church of the Shepherd and who we are as United Methodist Christians. And one of the questions I ask is like, what do you know about United Methodist Christianity? Or what do you love about United Methodist Christianity? And people say things like, we're not like one political perspective, or we're not judgmental, or we're not fundamentalist, and we welcome and include all people as created in the image of God. And all those are true, and I love that. But implied in that is not all Christians express it the same way. And yet we all follow the same person, right? Who is that? John Wesley. Oh, no, I'm just joking. No, Jesus. John Wesley was the founder of the Methodist movement. But we follow Jesus, so I'm just teasing. But I want to say that because whenever we talk about Christians, we understand the nuances of different traditions, of more extreme fundamentalist versions and more like Methodist versions. The same thing is true with Judaism. The same thing is true with Islam. In fact, even within Israel right now, there are many different people from many different religions, including there's over 300,000 Christians in between Palestine and Jerusalem. And there are many people who are not religious at all. And yet, but there are also Christians, as well as Jewish persons, as well as Islamic persons, as well as non-religious people and different religious people who are all actively working for peace. And I think that's important to just make sure we understand when we talk about religious differences, it's not a simple idea. It's complicated, right? There's also, so the religious differences, there's also historical differences. So the land we think about as Israel is a land that has been known for being occupied by many different groups historically. So we can think about some of them. I talked last week about the Assyrian Empire. I talked about the Babylonian Empire. We can talk about the Persian Empire. We can talk about when Jesus lived, who was it occupied? The Roman Empire. And I say that, and most recently, it was occupied by the Ottoman Empire from 1516 to 1917. Which is over 400 years. That's a really, really long time. And it's a nation that has been occupied by many. The reason we have this idea that it belongs to the Jewish people is because in our scriptures, in the Jewish scriptures, and I would add the Islamic scriptures, God promised to Abraham's descendants, all three of which we claim, that this land would be given to Abraham's descendants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we get this idea. Now, when God promised that to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it was also occupied by other people. In fact, when historically in the scriptures, whenever the Jewish people finally took control over Israel, it was occupied by the Canaanites, an individual group. So I simply say that because there's always history of whose land it belongs to. Now, in 1917, at the end of World War I, Great Britain, with support of the Allied countries, decided, mainly because of our Zionist understanding of the Hebrew scriptures, that should be established as a Jewish national state. And so Great Britain governed half of Jerusalem, took control at the end of the war of half of Jerusalem. Jordan took control of the other half. That existed from 1917 until 1948. And in 1948, Israel became an independent Jewish nation. Now, part of the consequence of that, because it was other people lived there. Remember the Ottoman Empire from I want to make sure I get the dates right, 1516 to 1917, other people lived there. And so between 1917 and 1948, and this is where I'm going to give you two different histories. Between 1917 and 1948, over 700,000 Palestinians. From a Palestinian perspective, they would say were forcibly removed from their homes. And this isn't that long ago. Some of you may remember or may have been born before 1948. Many of us, our parents, our grandparents would know this. So what we would hear if we were Palestinian is our family was kicked out of our homes and we were forced to relocate in a tent refugee community. And we would say, no. I know it because my parents told me and they were there. I know it because my grandparents were there and they were there and they witnessed it, and I know it to be true. That would be a Palestinian perspective. And a Jewish perspective, the same history, is that between around 1948, that Jordan told all the Palestinians to leave to go on vacation for 2 weeks. And during that 2 weeks, they were going to wage war against the Jewish people in Jerusalem, and they were going to drive them into the sea. And in 1948, Israel, the Jewish leader-led Israel, actually won that war. And so the Palestinians that vacated their homes and took their keys with them. In fact, if you go to Gaza, if you go to the West Bank, you'll see many keys that they're holding on to because they were told they could go back to their homes. But from the Jewish perspective, no, they left to fight a war, and they lost the war, and they aren't allowed to come back into their homes. Now, and they would tell you, I know this because my parents were there and they told me. I know this because my grandparents were there and they told me. Now you can see how this gives you two very different stories, and you are convinced that your story is the right one. And what I'm convinced is it's complicated, right? So there's historical differences, and there's religious differences. There's also economic differences. So from 1948, Israel has received far more, from 1917 on, really, far more financial assistance and support, mostly from Western countries like the United States, far more than the Palestinians. And so the economic conditions of Jerusalem, of Jewish-led Israel, is financially just so much in a different place than the Palestinian communities. In fact, in many places in the Palestinian communities, partially justified, partially isn't, but they are landlocked. They are controlled into Gaza, into the West Bank, and people cannot leave. And they cannot get aid. They cannot get food. They cannot get medical supplies. They cannot get basic needs of food and shelter and clothing and some of the things. And so there's places where there's a lot of people in a small area that they can do nothing about it. And when there's poverty, it rises up with violence and terrorism. Violence and terrorism feeds off of poverty. And so there's significant economic conditions that are feeding this because people can exploit them, because people can take advantage of them. And I mention all those because it is complicated. And anybody who tells you differently either has an agenda or is ignorant. And I claim the ignorance for myself. And I also give you that because we're talking about over the next several weeks, as we lead up to Christmas, 4 gifts that Jesus came to bring that we desperately need, and yet we may not always realize how much we can appreciate them. And today I want to talk about the gift of peace. And I want to read a story from Isaiah. This is from the same scripture, the Bible book that we read from last week. This is from Isaiah. This is earlier in Isaiah. This is when Isaiah was talking to the Israelite leaders that God was going to stop protecting them from the Assyrian Empire and later the Babylonian Empire, that God was going to stop protecting them because they've been worshiping other gods and because they haven't been caring for the poor and the needy and the oppressed. And I want you to hear this because in the middle of this warning, Isaiah also gives threads, small messages of hope. And this is one of the messages that Isaiah gives on behalf of God. This comes from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 9, verse 6. A child is born to us. A son is given to us, and authority will be on his shoulders. He will be named the Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be vast authority and endless peace for David's throne and for his kingdom, establishing and sustaining it with justice and righteousness now and forever. And the zeal of the heavenly forces will do this. This is the word of God for all of God's creation. Thanks be to God. So here's my question. Is peace on earth possible? Like, the Isaiah talks about this baby who's going to be born, who's going to bring endless peace. Anybody see that? And who's that baby? Like, we think the baby Isaiah's talking about is who? Jesus. That's what we think. Are we wrong? Did Jesus not do what Isaiah said Jesus is going to do? Is peace on earth just a naive religious pipe dream? Like, how do we make sense of this? What's our role in peace and understanding it? And all of this in one 25, maybe 30-minute sermon today. Simple, right? I say that because, like, if that is that simple, somebody far smarter than me would have already done it, like, namely Jesus. So here's the question I've been thinking about. What if Jesus really did bring peace on earth and we just haven't noticed it? What if Jesus really did do what he said he did? We just don't really understand it. So let's talk about that concept for a little bit. Whenever we think about war, we think about like big countries. We think about nationalities. We think about forces and powers that are way bigger than us. And I've been thinking about war, and what I've come to realize, and this is going to shock you, this is going to surprise the heck out of you. War is about people. Now, we don't think about that, but war is about people. Anytime we hear about war, we hear about people. We hear about people who are dying. We hear about people who are fighting. We hear about leaders. In fact, the leaders of the nations who are at war, going back to Israel and Hamas, I can't say his last name, but the leader of Hamas is Ishmael, and he is married, and he has 13 children. He has 13 people that call him dad. The leader of the Jewish people, Benjamin, and because I didn't say the leader of, I'll just leave it at Benjamin, he's married and has 3 children who call him dad. These are people who are people's children and brothers and sisters, and it's not an abstract concept. But war is about people. And here's why this is important. Grab your socks because I'm about to blow them off. If war is about people, peace is about people. It's not like this, it's this abstract concept. It's about ordinary people like you and me that Jesus says, I come to bring peace. And through bringing peace, I wonder if maybe Jesus actually did it, but we haven't fully realized it yet. So there's a book that I read a couple of years ago. It's a phenomenal book. I'd highly recommend it. It's called The Anatomy of Peace by the Arbinger Institute. And this quote really shouldn't be a quote. It's kind of what I extracted from this. But whenever we talk about peace or war, we think about war as peace as the absence of war conflict. But they redefine it. They say peace is a state of being in right relationship with others. Think about that for a second. What would it take for you to be in right relationship with others? What would it take for you at school, at work, well, at your Thanksgiving table to be at peace in right relationship with others? Because I don't know about you, but I suspect there's some of us here, some of us who are worshiping online, who might be more optimistic of peace in the Middle East than there is maybe peace within our own siblings or our own parents or peace with our own kids. And the Anatomy of Peace explores that idea and asks this question I find fascinating. Is your heart at war? Or maybe I should say, who is your heart at war with? And I think about that question because normally I think, well, no, I'm not mad at anybody right now. And it's probably true right now, but then later this afternoon, I'll be driving down 364 and somebody will zoom by me and cut me off right in front and I'll honk and I will lose my mind over just some random person that I don't know. Why? And if I'm really honest, it's not about them. It's really about what's inside here that I haven't really dealt with. And I think about this because there's just stupid, silly things that I do. Like I'll stand up in church and on a tangent, I'll just go off on like John Mozeliak because of like the pitchers he didn't pitch or he signed that are way too old and mediocre, and I want my book. And in the middle of a sermon, I'll like forget that John Mozeliak may be worshiping online or some of his family maybe, and he's a person and he has family. Okay, like, why do I do that? And the problem isn't with John Mozeliak. The problem really, okay, maybe it's a little bit him. Mostly me. It helps that he got Sonny Gray. That helps a little bit. Who is your heart at war with whenever you hear them? Your blood, like your blood, you see them on the news, you hear about them, and maybe it's not a them, but a they. Maybe it's a perspective, maybe it's a race, maybe it's the way they dress, the way they talk, we all have them. That we think we're at peace, and then all of a sudden that comes out. Our hearts. Who is your heart at war with? Do you really believe that God might actually be able to change your heart in a way that you wouldn't be at war? I wonder if the war inside of us is interfering with the life that God wants for us. I wonder if Jesus really did come to bring peace on earth, but maybe it isn't out there somewhere, but it's right here. And maybe he's done it and I haven't realized it yet. Jesus actually, as I looked at his ministry, lived peace in a way that I don't think we fully appreciate. Think about the time and culture Jesus lived in. We like to think, oh, it's so divisive or so. Heck, we don't have any wars going on right now. And literally in Jesus' time they did. They just as much division, probably more so. I think we underestimate that. There's so much. Jesus literally spent time with somebody who was going to betray him, and he knew it. And he still lived at peace with the guy who was going to betray him and send him to his death. How did he do that? There's two things that he did that I think are remarkable. They're ordinary, but I think they need to be named. And the first is that he listened to us. And I think that's powerful. And I think it's powerful that Jesus asked a ton of questions. If you read Jesus' life, you'll notice how many questions he asked. And that's important because we, as United Methodist Christians, but as all Christians, we believe we worship a God who's three persons, but one God. And you can't understand it. It's a holy mystery. But there's God the parent, God the child, God the Spirit. Three persons, one God. And one of the persons who is God is Jesus. And Jesus says, hey, I'm going to come as a baby, and I want to listen. Now, if Jesus is God and he's human, and God knows everything, right, why does he listen to us? Like, if he already knows, why does he ask questions if he knows the answers? I think it's because Jesus knows that asking questions and listening is an expression of love. That asking questions and listening is a way to build reconciliation and peace. Asking questions and listening. And I don't mean like listening in a way to argue. Do you ever do that? Like as a preacher's preaching, man, like I'm going to start making notes. I'm going to email him at Ben_Rush at CS. See, there you go, Ben. I'm going to, like, you know this. You're arguing with your parents. You're arguing with your kids. And as they're talking, like, I'm going to wait my turn. Okay, there. I'm going to say this. Oh, this. Oh, you start, like, I use my fingers so I don't remember. And then I, like, start arguing back. And, like, 1 and 2. I don't know 3. But, you know, whenever you start arguing, listening to argue, you know what's really going on? Your heart is at war. When you're willing to listen in a way that helps you understand. So listening to understand is whenever somebody does things, you're like, I am so mad. How could they do that? I don't understand how in the world. And when you use that phrase, I don't understand. You know who has a problem when we don't understand? It's me. I don't understand. So listening to understand is say, I don't understand. How in the world you thought that was a good idea to stay out till 3 a.m. and not tell me? Help me understand that choice you made. And it's genuinely in a way that creates reconciliation and peace and empathy. And that's the second thing Jesus did. He came to walk with us. There's a word we use at Christmas time for God, for Jesus specifically, called Emmanuel. We sing it at the very first song. Emmanuel, Emmanuel. It's God who is with us. That God, all powerful, like the superhero, like can beat any other superhero, who's literally invincible, decided, hey, you know what? Because I love humans, I want to come and walk with them and be with them. But God didn't say, I want to show up like in a buff, like adult way. He shows up as a baby, not only any baby, but a baby in the middle of a time where there's very little medical support and a backwoods country trough to two poor, unmarried people who had no idea. And that God became an infant. Think about how vulnerable an infant is. The first time you hold a baby, you're like, I don't want to break it. I still get nervous holding babies at like baptism. I'm like, make sure I don't do anything wrong. Like, it's incredible, vulnerable. Why did God do that? I wonder if God said, I want to learn how hard it is to begin to walk. I want to learn how difficult it is to be able to not communicate and be teething. I want to learn how uncomfortable it is to be an awkward teenager. And we've all been an awkward teenager. And Jesus says, I want to experience that because I want to learn to create empathy and walk with you. Andy Stanley, a preacher in Atlanta years ago, said this. He said, let me make sure. He said, let's see if I can find what he said. He said, when people make choices that you don't understand, our basic assumption, his basic choice is that if I had experienced what they had experienced, if I had listened to the voices they had listened to, if I had seen what they'd seen, then I would understand the choices, the decisions, the thing they say, do, and think better than I do that right now. That doesn't mean I'd make the same choices, but I'd at least understand it differently, right? Imagine if we had understood and experienced what it was like from the very youngest years, what it was like to hear that our parents we had a home, we had a business, we had everything in Jerusalem, and they kicked us out and forced us to live here in a tent. They robbed us of that. Imagine how that would change your perspective. Imagine what it would be like to hear for generation after generation how your people have been oppressed and captured and enslaved and tortured and mass genocide simply because of your ethnic identity, and how you've been persecuted and how you're receiving the thing that God promised to you. Imagine how that shapes how you experience the world today. I don't understand what's going on in Israel. But part of it is because I haven't seen and lived and learned and experienced what they have experienced, right? And whenever I begin to realize that, what happens is I begin to discover peace that isn't out there somewhere, but peace that begins to change my heart to be more like God's heart, to change my heart. What if Jesus really did bring peace on earth, but we haven't fully embraced it in a way that helps us experience what Jesus did 2,000 years ago? The Hebrew word for peace is shalom. Shalom is used as a greeting. Shalom. It's used as a goodbye. Shalom. It's used throughout worship and regularly. Shalom isn't about the absence of war or conflict. Shalom describes a state of being in harmony and wholeness. Shalom describes the creation as God originally created it and intended it to be. Shalom is this being of experiencing the life that Jesus came to not only show us, but to give to us. What if Jesus actually brought shalom and we haven't fully received the gift that God has for us? And peace isn't about vague concepts. Peace is about people, because war is about people. And peace is something that begins inside you and inside me. And that's the gift that Jesus came to bring. So I want to close by praying for us. Last week, I invited you to hold imaginary unopened Christmas gift. If you want to get that Christmas gift out, if you haven't opened it yet, if you've opened it, then you can't participate, sorry. But if you haven't opened it yet, get out your imaginary unopened Christmas gift. Hold it in your hands. God, thank you. Thank you for giving us the gifts that maybe we aren't on our Amazon wish list that our family can find and we also want, but the gifts that our hearts desperately need and desire. The gifts of hope, the gift of peace. And we look for peace in ways that maybe just aren't fair. Not because you can't do it, but because we aren't willing to. Maybe we look for peace for you to do something that our sin keeps us from. In our own lives, in our community, in our work, in our school, in our homes, and in our world. Maybe we look at the ways peace isn't done for those people, but we ignore the way that our hearts aren't experiencing, living, and receiving the gift of peace that you came to give us and show us. Help us to receive a gift that we desperately need to heal our brokenness, to heal our hearts, to restore our hearts to a place of peace with all of people and with you. We thank you for the gift that you've given us in Jesus Christ. Help us to receive it. Help us to experience it. Help us to open it with joy. Amen.